Hello everyone, this is Wandering Tati. Today we'll continue learning about the most common cognitive biases. These are shortcuts that our brains like to take, which may lead to distorted thinking and could affect our decision making and behavior in negative ways. As we judge the world and make decisions, we like to think that we are logical and capable of evaluating all the information available objectively, but none of us can completely escape from these biases. That's why I think it's important to be aware of them to prevent us from making poor decisions or bad judgments, or to point out politely to someone else that they might be influenced by one of those. The first bias of the day is declinism. Everything was better in the good old days, right? No, probably not. That's the declinism bias talking. It's this way of thinking where we believe the past was much better than it actually was, and we expect the future to be way worse than it will likely be. For instance, when someone prefers all this and claims that they don't make music like they used to back in the day, they are probably experiencing this bias. They might not be giving current music a fair shot because they believe older music was inherently better, which isn't necessarily true. Does this happen to you with music, movies, or something like that from a particular time period? Let me know in the comments. A phrase we all know that could exemplify this bias is Since the phrase is pretty vague and voters might think everything was better at some point in the past, they might support this leader thinking they can bring back those good old days, whatever those may be. The greatest tragedy of declinism could be that our collective expectation of decline may lead to some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. This bias can lead to a sense of hopelessness and despair, and to a lack of motivation and ambition. It can drive us to not invest in the future anymore as we become pessimistic about the future of our society or nation. So, how to deal with it? We need to challenge our thoughts about the past. Ask yourself, was everything really as perfect as I remember it to be? Chances are some things weren't as great as you remember. As we are often overwhelmed with negative stories, finding and focusing on the good news that I assure you we can find helps to balance our view of the world and make a better assessment as to where it might be going towards. Another point is that we should compare facts and not feelings. It's easy to let emotions guide you, but they can be misleading. Looking at actual data and evidence can give you a clearer picture of then versus now. And finally, allowing yourself to try something new can remind you that there are amazing new things happening every day. Listen to new music. You can always go back to your oldies, but there's room for everything, and I'm pretty sure there are some wonderful new things out there for you to enjoy. Next bias is just world hypothesis. Here, your preference for justice makes you presume it exists.
God, I've had to work hard every day of my life, and what do I have to show for it? This briefcase and this haircut. And what do you have to show for your lifetime of sloth and ignorance?
What?
Everything! A dream house, 2 cars, a beautiful wife, a son who owns a factory, fancy clothes, and lobsters for dinner!
Unfortunately, in this world, bad people don't always get what's coming to them, hard work doesn't always pay off, and injustice of any sort happens all the time. And this is an uncomfortable truth that threatens our preferred or desired narrative. This bias is associated with ideas such as what goes around comes around, or the concept of karma, for instance. And what's even more worrying is that it can also lead us to blaming the victims of crime and circumstance. Let us all remember that everyone has their own life story with their own set of difficulties, that we're all fallible, and that bad things happen to good people all the time. So how could we fight against this bias? Something we can do, and that in fact applies to all biases, is taking a step back to prevent ourselves from making rash, distorted assessments. One tool that's available to combat the negative attitudes towards victims that may yield from the just world hypothesis is empathy. empathy. In one experiment led by researchers Aderman, Brehm, and Katz, participants were asked to watch a video of a woman receiving electric shocks based on her performance in a learning task. Before watching this tape, they were either asked to imagine themselves in this scenario, this group would be the empathy-inducing group, or to simply watch the woman in the tape. Those from the first group were much less likely to derogate the victim, demonstrating less influence of the just word hypothesis. Thus, if we can remember to think critically rather than instinctively and put ourselves in the shoes of others, we can more accurately assess any situation. Afterwards, we have optimism bias. If you are influenced by this bias, you overestimate the likelihood of positive outcomes. It might lead us to believe things like bad things won't happen to me or that everything will work out in the end, even when there is no evidence to support this. There can be benefits to having a positive attitude, of course, but it's unwise to allow a blind positivism to negatively affect our ability to make rational judgments. Wishful thinking can in fact create more negative outcomes, like in the case of problems with gambling, for example. What's scary about this bias is that assuming that everything is or is going to be just fine might prevent us from doing much necessary changes. For instance, there are some studies arguing that optimism bias limits people's perception about their susceptibility to environmental hazards, thus leading to a human inaction. And this bias could even be detrimental to our own health, physical or mental, as we may perceive ourselves as safer than others in situations that equally threaten everybody. So no, being the Lulu is not the Solulu after all. I have never said that in my life before. If you make rational, realistic judgments, you have a lot more to feel positive about. And along those lines, we have pessimism bias.
Good morning, Christopher Robin.
Oh, good morning, Winnie the Pooh.
Good morning, Pooh Bear.
Good morning, Pooh Bear.
If it is a good morning, which I doubt.
As you might have guessed, here you overestimate the likelihood of negative outcomes. Pessimism may be a defense mechanism against disappointment.
Expect disappointment and you will never get disappointed.
But this general attitude of expecting always the worst outcome can have considerable ramifications on both a personal and societal level. A note here, a persistent pessimism could be a symptom of depression and anxiety disorders. But in those cases, of course, the best approach is to ask for help from a qualified professional. Another small clarification, they may be confused at times, but pessimism is very different from skepticism. Skepticism is a rational approach that seeks to remain impartial, while pessimism is an expectation of bad outcomes. Have you ever known someone who studied a lot but still thought they were going to fail every exam? What about someone who thinks everyone will dislike them? And why am I both of those examples? Pessimists may justify their attitude by saying that they will either be vindicated or pleasantly surprised. But a pessimistic attitude may also limit potential positive outcomes. We may not end up taking a new challenge, for example, due to an over-perception of our probability to fail. There is a study by Mansour, Shuni, and Knapp that asked participants to imagine that a coin would be flipped 10 times with a payout of $10 if it landed on heads. They were asked how often they expected to win, and even though the sample size of the study was over 105,000 individuals, the average answer was 3.9, well below the expected average of 5. The authors suggested that a pessimistic bias resulted in people overestimating the likelihood of losing a toss, while simultaneously underestimating the likelihood of winning one. And perhaps the worst aspect of pessimism is that even if something good happens, you'll probably feel pessimistic about it anyway.
There now. Did I get your tail back on properly, Eeyore?
No matter. Most likely lose it again anyway.
So how can we combat this bias? We could try to focus on evidence and look at past outcomes to make a better assessment of the situation. We could try to adopt a problem-solving mindset and take action in what we can control regarding the situation, and write possible solutions to challenges we may encounter instead of dwelling on the problems themselves. And we can also look for other people's perspective, as they might be able to see the bigger picture since they are not personally involved. And the last one for today, negativity bias. Here, you allow negative things to disproportionately influence your thinking. Unlike the pessimism bias, which focuses on predictions for the future, this bias focuses on the past or present, by giving greater weight to negative information or experiences. It could come in the form of remembering one hurtful comment from a friend more vividly than dozens of kind words they've said to us in the past, or by focusing on a single piece of bad feedback in an otherwise wonderful performance review, for example. Rosin and Roisman coined the term and referred to it as follows. The principle, which we call negativity bias, is that in most situations, negative events are more salient, potent, dominant in combinations, and generally efficacious than positive events. As many of these biases, it has an evolutionary explanation to it. After all, paying attention to negative information in the environment has survival value. We had to be always aware of danger in order to quickly and appropriately respond to it and to, live another day. We are primed for survival, and our aversion to pain can distort our judgment for this modern world. In an evolutionary context, it makes sense for us to be heavily biased towards avoiding threats. But because this bias affects our judgments in other ways, it means that we aren't giving enough weight to the positives. How can we fight this? Having pro and con lists, as well as thinking in terms of probabilities, could help you evaluate things more objectively than relying on a cognitive impression. That was the last bias I had planned for the video. There's still plenty of others that I believe are interesting to talk about, so I will cover them in another video. Especially in this day and age, the amount of information we receive can be quite overwhelming. We need to step back and ponder things deeply, and do our best not to jump to conclusions hastily. I would love to read you in the comments. Do you think you've been influenced by any of these biases? I really hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please remember to like, share and subscribe to support the channel. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. Until next time! Has survival value.